The wind here in the dried-up ghost town wasn't a whisper, it was a dry, rasping sigh, dragging grit across the weathered planks of what used to be a general store. My current abode. I traced a finger through the dust on a grimy windowpane, watching the distant shimmer of heat rise from the cracked asphalt of the old Main Street. Nothing moved but the dust devils and the occasional tumbleweed. This desolation suited me, the silence a balm to the constant clamor of the world's unsolved puzzles. It allowed my mind to stretch, to wander through the forgotten corners of logic without interruption. My only connection to that other world, a relic of a satellite phone, squawked from the scarred wooden counter. It was a sound I rarely heard, and when I did, it usually meant something had gone spectacularly wrong. I let it ring twice more, a small indulgence, before picking it up. UserNL, I stated, my voice a little rough from disuse, the words feeling heavy in the still air. UserNL, thank the heavens, the voice on the other end crackled, relief evident. It was the superintendent, a man whose patience I'd tested on more than one occasion. We have a situation. A monumental situation. It's impossible. I leaned against the counter, already sifting through his intonation, the slight tremor in his voice. Impossible is a strong word, superintendent. Usually, it just means someone hasn't looked hard enough. Not this time, UserNL. This is different. Alistair Finch. Dead. The name hit me with the quiet force of a distant gong. He lived in a veritable fortress, a monument to his paranoia and his priceless collection. Finch? I repeated, a flicker of genuine interest sparking in the calm expanse of my thoughts. How? That's the impossible part. He was found in his study. Door locked from the inside. Windows barred, sealed. No sign of forced entry anywhere. Not a single pane of glass disturbed, not a scratch on the reinforced steel door. The security system? Fully active, undisturbed. No one went in, no one came out, according to every sensor, every camera feed. The superintendent's voice dropped, laced with a frustration that bordered on despair. And yet, he's dead. A single, clean gunshot wound to the temple. His own antique dueling pistol, found beside him. But here's the kicker, UserNL. The Chronos Scroll is gone. The Chronos Scroll. A ripple went through me, something akin to an electric current. It wasn't just an ancient artifact, it was a legendary piece, rumored to contain historical truths that could rewrite entire epics. Finch had acquired it only recently, after decades of relentless pursuit. Its value wasn't merely monetary, it was academic, historical, almost mythical. A locked room, a suicide weapon, a missing artifact of incalculable value, I murmured, piecing together the initial fragments. And no one could have entered or left. I walked over to my desk, a battered wooden table piled with maps, half-finished crossword puzzles. A magnifying glass. I picked up a smooth river stone, turning it over in my palm, feeling its cool, dense weight. Tell me about the room itself. Any peculiarities? Beyond being a vault? Finch was meticulous. No hidden passages, no secret compartments we could find. The walls are solid stone, the ceiling reinforced concrete. It's a box, UserNL. A sealed box. And the body? Position? Any other details? I pressed, my mind already building a rudimentary mental model of the scene. Finch was at his desk. Slumped over it, actually. The pistol was on the floor, a few feet from his outstretched hand. No note. No signs of a struggle. It looks staged, if you ask me. Too neat for a violent death, too contained for a break-in. Staged, you say. An observation, or an intuition? I asked, a faint smile playing on my lips. It was good to hear someone else was thinking beyond the obvious. Both, I suppose. My team is baffled. The forensics crew is tearing their hair out. We have no leads, no suspects, no how. That's why I called you. You're the only one I know who thrives on this sort of impossibility. I paused, the dry wind outside rattling a loose shutter. This wasn't just a murder, it was a defiance of physics, a thumbed nose at conventional logic. A challenge. My reclusive existence, usually a choice, now felt like a preparatory training ground. This was precisely the kind of knot I was built to untangle. Send me the preliminary reports, Superintendent. Everything. Blueprints of the estate, security logs, forensic findings, witness statements from anyone on the property, and arrange transport. I'll need to be there by morning. Consider it done, UserNL. Anything else? One thing, I said, my gaze sweeping over the dusty shelves filled with forgotten goods. Tell me about Finch's known enemies. Or, more importantly, his rivals in the world of antiquities. The Chronos Scroll wasn't just a pretty bauble. It was a declaration. The superintendent grunted. Alistair Finch made enemies like other men collect stamps. We've got a list. A long one. But how could any of them have done this? It's a ghost's work. Perhaps, I mused, the river stone cool against my palm. Or perhaps a ghost with a very clever hand. I hung up, the click of the phone echoing in the vast quiet. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the skeletal remains of the dried-up ghost town in hues of orange and purple. The wind still sighed, but now it sounded different, carrying a faint, distant hum of a puzzle waiting to be solved. My solitude was about to be broken. I had a lot to pack. And even more to think about. I hung up, the click of the phone echoing in the vast quiet. I ran a hand through my hair, the grit of the desert clinging to my fingers. A renowned historian, dead in a locked room, a priceless artifact vanished. It was a classic, meticulously crafted setup, and those were always my favorites. The drive out of the dried-up ghost town was a stark contrast to the journey in. The desolate landscape slowly gave way to manicured lawns and towering iron gates that announced the Finch estate. It was an imposing structure, old money clinging to every brick, a fortress designed to protect secrets as much as its inhabitants. Police cruisers dotted the driveway, their blue lights flashing a silent, rhythmic warning. A uniformed officer, younger than he probably felt, nodded me through the main gate, having clearly received his instructions. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy with unspoken words and the lingering scent of old paper and polished wood. A senior investigator, a stern woman with weary eyes, met me in the grand foyer. UserNL. Glad you could make it. We've secured the study, but frankly, we're at a loss. No forced entry. No obvious exit. And the Chronos Scroll. Gone. She gestured towards a closed door at the end of a long hallway. We've got the family and a few others waiting. Try not to rattle them too much. Rattling is often a prerequisite for clarity, I murmured, my eyes scanning the ornate ceiling, the dark tapestries, the heavy, silence-absorbing curtains. This house wasn't just old, it felt ancient, like it had absorbed centuries of whispers. My first interview was with the heir, a man named Mr. Harrington. He sat stiffly on an antique sofa, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He wore a tailored suit, impeccable even in his distress. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine. A terrible tragedy, he began, his voice thin. My uncle was a brilliant man, but eccentric. Always with his artifacts. And the Chronos Scroll? I asked, leaning forward slightly. What can you tell me about its significance? He cleared his throat. It's an old parchment. Very valuable, yes. But its historical claims were often debated. Uncle Alistair believed it was genuine, a true record from a lost civilization. Others, like Professor Caldwell, dismissed it as a clever forgery. His gaze flickered towards a closed door, then quickly away. Uncle Alistair was convinced it held some key to. Well, he never fully explained. Something about time, or cycles. He was very secretive about it. Lately. Secretive how? I pressed. Did he have any enemies? Anyone who might want to discredit him, or take the scroll? Academics are always rivals, he said with a dismissive wave. But enemies? No. And as for taking it, it's only valuable to a collector or a museum. Not something someone would kill for. His denial felt a little too emphatic, a little too quick. He seemed more concerned with the perception of his uncle's work than the actual loss. I noted the slight tremor in his right hand, the way he kept adjusting an invisible cuff. He was nervous, yes, but also calculating. Next, I spoke with the estranged niece, a woman named Miss Thorne. He was younger, dressed in practical clothes, and sat with an air of detached resignation. Uncle Alistair and I hadn't spoken in years, she admitted, her voice flat. Not since he dismissed my research on ancient trade routes as uninspired fiction. He could be demanding, obsessive. About what, specifically? I inquired. Lately? The scroll. Always the scroll, she replied, a hint of bitterness in her tone. He believed it contained some sort of predictive algorithm, charting historical patterns. He even tried to convince me it held the key to future market trends. Said it was worth more than any gold. Something about a symposium where Caldwell publicly questioned the scroll's authenticity. Uncle Alistair took it very personally. Said Caldwell was trying to sabotage him. An algorithm? Market trends? That was a peculiar turn for an ancient artifact. Did he have any security concerns about the scroll? He always had concerns, she scoffed. More alarms than Fort Knox. But he was particularly jumpy after Caldwell's comments. Said someone was closing in on his discovery. Her eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of something unreadable there. Resentment, perhaps, or a deeper sadness she wouldn't show. The household staff, a quiet woman who had served the Finch family for decades, was next. He was impeccably polite, her answers clipped and precise. Dr. Finch kept to himself, mostly, she stated, her hands clasped in front of her apron. Always in his study. No one was permitted inside without his express invitation. Did he have any regular visitors, apart from family? I inquired. Professor Caldwell, occasionally. And a few other academics, but Dr. Finch had become quite reclusive in the last few months. He'd often ask me to hold his calls, even from Mr. Harrington. Her gaze was steady, but I noticed a slight tightening around her mouth when I mentioned Mr. Harrington. He also had a new safe installed, just for the scroll. Said the old one wasn't sufficiently robust for its true value. True value? I echoed. Did he elaborate? She hesitated, then shook her head. Only that it was beyond monetary measure. He was very passionate about his work. Loyal, yes. There was a guardedness there, a sense of something unspoken lingering just beneath the surface of her calm demeanor. Finally, Professor Caldwell, the rival academic. He was a man of sharp intellect, his eyes bright behind thick-rimmed glasses, his movements precise. He seemed almost invigorated by the tragedy, a macabre intellectual curiosity replacing any pretense of grief. Alistair's death is a loss to the historical community. Certainly, he began, his voice smooth and articulate. But frankly, his obsession with the Chronos Scroll had become problematic. Problematic how? Professor? I questioned, sensing I was finally getting closer to the scroll's true nature. The scroll, he explained, leaning forward, is a fascinating piece, no doubt. But its provenance is highly questionable. Alistair, however, became convinced it was a true record from a pre-dynastic civilization, not merely a relic, but a tool. He believed it contained a complex system of celestial alignments and mathematical progressions that could, and this is where he truly lost his way, predict significant historical events. He even claimed it could reveal patterns in economic crashes, political upheavals. This was far beyond simple academic rivalry. Indeed, he was growing increasingly agitated, convinced he was on the verge of a monumental breakthrough. He believed the scroll held a temporal algorithm, his words, not mine, that would rewrite our understanding of causality. He spoke of its unveiling very soon. He even hinted that certain powerful individuals would pay any price for such knowledge. He was, to put it mildly, becoming a liability to himself. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, a flicker of something akin to smug satisfaction in his eyes. I tried to warn him, of course, that such claims would attract the wrong kind of attention. But Alistair was never one to listen. I stood there, the pieces beginning to swirl into a dizzying mosaic. A dangerous, all-consuming obsession. The locked room was still a mystery, but the motive was starting to coalesce, far more intricate than simple theft. And they were willing to kill for it. Temporal algorithm, Caldwell had said, controlling T. The words echoed in the quiet of my temporary office, a small, cluttered space I'd commandeered at the estate. They were a pebble dropped into a still pond, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. Finch, a renowned historian, but also, as whispers suggested, a man on the precipice of radical thought. Was this temporal algorithm the key to what Caldwell had implied? A way to control time itself? The idea felt absurd, yet it resonated with the impossible nature of the crime. I pulled out my notes, the heir's nervous twitch, the niece's casual dismissal of market value, the staff's bewildered comments about a new safe and something beyond monetary measure. It all pointed to the scroll being more than just an artifact. It was a catalyst, a key, or perhaps a blueprint. My next stop was the estate manager, a prim, bespectacled individual who handled Finch's sprawling finances. He sat across from me in the drawing room, hands clasped, a picture of controlled exasperation. UserNL, Dr. Finch's affairs were in order. Impeccable, if somewhat unorthodox. Unorthodox how? I pressed, leaning forward. He sighed, adjusting his spectacles. He had a penchant for speculative investments. Highly speculative. A significant portion of his assets, particularly over the last 6 months, were channeled into a venture capital fund researching. Well, it was rather opaque. Something about historical data extrapolation and predictive modeling. Historical data extrapolation, I repeated, a connection forming. And the Chronos Scroll? The manager shifted uncomfortably. The scroll, while invaluable, was never formally listed as an asset in the conventional sense. It was more of a cornerstone. He believed it held unique properties for his research. But financially, yes, he was heavily leveraged. The inheritance, I'm afraid, is not as substantial as the public might assume, given the estate's perceived value. If this venture failed, the heir would be left with little more than the property and a mountain of theoretical debt. This was a significant turn. Not just academic rivalry, but financial desperation. Was the scroll the collateral? Or the ultimate prize of this predictive modeling? The heir's eagerness to dismiss the scroll's value now seemed less like indifference and more like a desperate attempt to distance himself from a potential financial disaster, or perhaps, a convenient alibi for its disappearance. I spent the rest of the afternoon sifting through Finch's academic papers, dusty journals, and archived correspondence. His early work was brilliant, groundbreaking even. But then, a distinct shift. Around 15 years ago, a series of increasingly abstract theories began to appear in his unpublished notes, references to chronological anchors, temporal resonance, and the re-evaluation of fixed causality. Most of these theories were met with scorn and outright dismissal by his peers. One name kept recurring in the margins, often alongside angry annotations: Professor Armitage. Armitage, a former mentor, had publicly denounced Finch's later work as pseudoscience bordering on delusion. A quick search revealed Armitage had retired abruptly years ago, vanishing from the academic scene. His last known address was a P.O. box associated with a remote, forgotten corner of the state, not far from the site of an old, abandoned mining operation. A dried-up ghost town, as the local maps called it. The kind of place people went to disappear. It felt like a long shot, but if anyone understood the depths of Finch's controversial theories, it would be the man who had once championed them, then publicly disavowed them. The drive was long, the paved roads giving way to crumbling asphalt, then finally just a dusty track winding through scrubland. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of dry earth and decay. The landscape flattened into a desolate expanse, punctuated by skeletal structures of what were once bustling homes and businesses. The wind, when it stirred, carried the mournful creak of rusting metal and the whisper of forgotten lives. This was the dried-up ghost town, a monument to failed dreams and the relentless march of time. A fitting place, perhaps, for someone obsessed with manipulating it. I found Armitage in a ramshackle cabin, the only sign of life in the entire forgotten settlement. He was a gaunt figure, his face a roadmap of deep lines, his eyes sharp and wary behind thick spectacles. He recognized me instantly. My reputation, it seemed, preceded me even here. UserNL, he rasped, his voice gravelly from disuse. Come to pick apart Finch's madness, have I? I'm here to understand it, I corrected, stepping inside. The cabin smelled of old paper and wood smoke. And to understand why he was murdered. Armitage scoffed, gesturing to a worn armchair. Murdered, for what? His theories were ridiculed, his insights dismissed. He called it an ontological key. He thought it contained a hidden temporal algorithm, a framework, not for time travel, as the sensationalists claimed, but for understanding and perhaps even predicting causal chains across history. He believed it could map the future by understanding the true, underlying mechanics of the past. The temporal algorithm Caldwell mentioned, I murmured, the pieces clicking into place. And the venture capital fund? Historical data extrapolation? Armitage nodded slowly. He sought to prove his Chronos theory with modern computational power. To show the scroll wasn't just ancient wisdom, but a living, predictive engine. He was convinced it could reveal patterns, even manipulate events, by understanding their true origins. But it was a dangerous game. He made powerful enemies, not just in academia. Among those who stood to lose if history could be rewritten. Even merely understood too well. What about his study's security? I wondered, shifting gears. The locked room. Alistair was paranoid, Armitage admitted. Not just about theft. About his research being stolen, corrupted. He designed a system for that study, not just locks, but an environmental control matrix, linked to specific atmospheric conditions, seismic readings, even his own biometric data. He always said, "If I fall, the truth falls with me, or at least, it's hidden until the right mind can find it." He spoke of a final, desperate reveal sequence, a sort of self-lock or information purge, that only he could initiate. A temporal failsafe, he called it, to protect his legacy from those who would misuse it. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. A temporal failsafe. Not just a locked room, but perhaps a room designed to be locked, or to reveal something only under specific, unseen conditions. Finch wasn't just protecting a scroll, he was protecting a dangerous idea. And in doing so, he might have orchestrated his own final, perplexing act. The phrase temporal failsafe had been gnawing at me, a persistent splinter under the skin of my investigation. I'd circled it, prodded it, tried to fit it into the neat pigeonhole of a simple locked room murder, but it refused to settle. If the room was designed to be locked under specific conditions, then the missing Chronos Scroll wasn't just a prize to be stolen, it was a trigger, a key, or perhaps even a red herring. The historian wasn't just protecting an artifact, he was protecting or exposing an idea, a secret. And that secret, I was increasingly convinced, was far more dangerous than any monetary value could account for. I spent another hour in the historian's study, not looking for what was there, but for what wasn't. The police had meticulously catalogued everything, but their focus was on the immediate crime scene. My focus was on the historian's mind, his habits, his recent preoccupations. I ignored the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light and concentrated on the subtle disruptions. His desk, usually a battlefield of parchment and monographs, seemed almost too tidy in places. A small, leather-bound notebook, almost hidden beneath a stack of printed articles on Coptic script, caught my eye. It wasn't his usual academic journal, the binding was rougher, the paper coarser. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakably his, but hurried, almost frantic. Most entries were mundane, dates for academic conferences, reminders to return library books. But interspersed were cryptic notes, sketches of symbols I didn't recognize, and names, not of scholars or institutions, but of places. One name recurred, underlined multiple times, a dried-up ghost town. Below it, a date, just a few days before his death, followed by a single, ominous word of verification. Verification of what? It wasn't a historical site he was known to be researching. The historian's passion was ancient civilizations, not abandoned mining settlements. This was a divergence, a tangent that felt distinctly personal, distinctly clandestine. My mind began to race, connecting the dots. The historian, a man obsessed with provenance, with the truth of history, suddenly delving into a forgotten ruin, just before his death, with a priceless artifact missing from a seemingly impenetrable room. It wasn't about the scroll as a simple theft. It was about what the scroll represented, or what it revealed. I made a few calls, quietly, asking around about the historian's recent activities, his temperament. The consensus was he'd become increasingly withdrawn, almost paranoid. One of his junior colleagues mentioned a heated argument with a prominent fellow scholar, another expert in ancient Mediterranean cultures, about the integrity of certain collections. The colleague had dismissed it as academic bickering. I didn't. The dried-up ghost town was a 2-hour drive out into the high desert, a place where the wind whistled through skeletal buildings and time had simply given up. The road dwindled to a crumbling track, kicking up plumes of red dust behind my vehicle. The air grew thin, the sun merciless. As I drove deeper into the desolation, the scattered remnants of wooden structures, bleached bone white, began to appear. A saloon with a gaping maw for a door, a general store whose shelves had long since collapsed. The silence was absolute, broken only by the creak of my tires and the distant cry of a hawk. It was the perfect place for secrets to fester, or to be buried. I found the fellow scholar's vehicle, a dusty, unremarkable sedan, parked haphazardly behind what looked like a collapsed assay office. He wasn't hard to spot. He stood in the shadow of a crumbling stone wall, hunched, staring out at the empty landscape, a figure of profound unease against the backdrop of decay. He hadn't expected me. His head snapped up, eyes wide, as my footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him. "UserNL," he stammered, his voice thin in the vast quiet. "What are I doing here?" "I could ask I the same, Professor," I replied, my voice calm, with an edge I hoped he'd detect. "This isn't exactly the British Museum's new annex, is it?" He shifted his weight, hands clenching and unclenching. I needed to think. Get away from it all. The shock of Alistair's death. Or perhaps, I suggested, stepping closer, letting the silence hang heavy between us, I came here to follow up on something Alistair was investigating. Something he was verifying just days before he died. His face paled, the color draining from his already ashen complexion. "I don't know what you're talking about." The historian wasn't just interested in the Chronos Scroll for its historical significance. I pressed, watching his eyes dart around, searching for an escape. He was interested in its provenance. And not just its ancient journey, but its very recent one. He suspected it was part of something larger, something illicit. I saw the flicker of recognition, the sudden tension in his jaw. He was becoming obsessed, the scholar muttered. Almost to himself. Speaking of forgeries, shadow markets, tainted legacies. He said the scroll wasn't just old, he said it held the key to exposing the rot at the core of our shared passion. And I dismissed him. I stated, not a question. He finally met my gaze, a flash of guilt in his eyes. I thought it was professional jealousy, perhaps a touch of paranoia. We had our disagreements. He was always so rigid about authenticity. But then he started talking about this place. Said he was meeting someone here, someone who could confirm his suspicions about a vast network of fakes being laundered through legitimate channels. He said the Chronos Scroll had a unique identifier, a flaw, that would prove it was part of a larger. As if afraid the empty buildings might be listening. Just that it was bigger than anyone imagined. He said he was going to expose them all. The Chronos Scroll wasn't just a historical document, it was a modern-day indictment. He was coming here to verify it, to meet his source. Just before he died. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The locked room, the temporal failsafe, the missing scroll, it wasn't a simple theft. It was a targeted assassination, a silencing. The historian wasn't killed for the scroll's value, but for what he knew about it, and what he was about to reveal. The scroll was the evidence, and the murder was an elaborate cover-up designed to look like a simple, opportunistic robbery. The killer wasn't after a relic, they were after the truth it held. And now, that truth was gone, along with the historian. But the trail, I realized, led not into the past, but into a very dangerous present. The last few pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening thud, just as I'd anticipated. It wasn't a simple theft. The revelation itself was the weapon, the motive, the very reason for the blood on the ornate carpet. I traced the chain of events in my mind, each link cold and logical. The locked room was a performance, an elaborate stage for murder. Finch, meticulous to a fault, would have had multiple layers of security. But what if one of those layers was designed to be exploited? The temporal failsafe, that obscure reference I'd found in Finch's personal notes, a security feature he'd designed himself, something meant to protect the Chronos Scroll above all else. It wasn't a failsafe against intruders, it was a failsafe against removal. The scroll itself. It wasn't just an artifact, it was the key. Finch had a system. If the scroll was lifted from its illuminated pedestal, the study's primary door would lock, sealing the room from the inside. A brilliant deterrent for a thief, meant to trap them with the evidence. But there was a secondary function, a time sequence Finch had never intended for public knowledge. A brief, almost imperceptible window where a secondary exit, disguised as part of the study's heavy shelving, would unlock. It would only open for 60 seconds, exactly, before sealing shut, tighter than a tomb. The temporal failsafe wasn't just about time, it was about timing. The killer knew this. They had access to Finch's notes, to his designs. They knew the intricacies of his system because they had helped him design it, or at least had intimate knowledge of it. That narrowed the field considerably, and the motive? The Chronos Scroll itself was a masterful forgery, a historical lie woven with such skill that it had fooled the world for decades. And its creator, the architect of this grand deception, was the very person Finch was about to expose. The historian, in his final days, had finally unearthed irrefutable proof of the scroll's fraudulent nature, and more damningly, the identity of its true craftsman. A colleague, once lauded alongside him, now facing utter ruin. The long-held secret wasn't just a forgery, it was the foundation of a celebrated career, built on sand. I thought of the subtle details, the almost imperceptible scuff mark on the rug near the bookshelf, not consistent with Finch's usual path, the faint scent of a specific, rare wood polish, different from the one Finch used, clinging to the air just outside that secondary exit. Most damning of all, the killer had left a single, almost microscopic fragment of a unique type of ancient papyrus, woven into the fabric of the scroll itself, that Finch had catalogued as a forgery tell, a signature of the perpetrator, hidden in plain sight. Finch had found it, identified it, and the killer knew he had. I had a name, an address, and a motive that burned with the slow fire of decades of resentment and fear. The collector, the one who had always seemed to stand in Finch's shadow, despite their own lauded career. The expert on ancient forgeries. The irony was palpable. I needed to confront them, but not on their turf. Not where they could manipulate their surroundings or disappear into the labyrinth of the city. I needed an arena that mirrored the desolation of their ambition. My car ate up the miles, the sun a copper disk sinking towards the horizon. I'd left a cryptic message for the collector, a question about the true provenance of a minor artifact I knew they had appraised years ago. An artifact connected to the region where the Chronos Scroll was supposedly discovered. I suggested a meeting, a quiet discussion to avoid unnecessary scrutiny. In a place where such discussions often took place away from prying eyes, the dried-up ghost town. It was a desolate sprawl of skeletal timber frames and crumbling adobe. A monument to forgotten dreams. Wind whistled through empty window panes, carrying the scent of dust and decay. I waited, leaning against the fender, watching the road. A plume of dust on the horizon, then the glint of chrome. It pulled to a stop 100 yards away, and the driver's side door opened. Out stepped the collector, their silhouette stark against the fading light. Their posture was rigid, their face a mask of practiced calm, but I could sense the tremor beneath the surface. A dusty old appraisal? I pushed off the car, my gaze steady. The appraisal was a pretext, as I well know. We're here to talk about something far more significant. The Chronos Scroll. Or rather, the Chronos forgery. A flicker in their eyes, quickly suppressed. I don't know what you're talking about. The scroll is a priceless piece of history. It's a masterpiece of deception, I countered, stepping closer. And Finch was about to expose it. He found the tell, didn't he? That specific papyrus fiber, unique to my early forgeries. He was going to publish, and my entire career, my reputation, everything I'd built, would have crumbled. The collector's jaw tightened. Alistair was a fool. Obsessed with minor details. He was going to destroy something beautiful, something I spent decades perfecting. Beautiful? I scoffed. I killed him to protect a lie. I used his own security system against him. The temporal failsafe. A brilliant touch, I admit. Lifts the scroll, the room locks from the inside, timer starts on the secret exit. I knew he'd trigger it, trying to protect his work. I slipped out, leaving him to look like he'd locked himself in. The scroll vanished, a perfect theft. Except it wasn't about the scroll's value, was it? It was about the secret it held. The collector's composure finally cracked. There. Eyes narrowed, a desperate glint appearing. He had to be stopped. He was going to ruin everything. Their hand twitched, moving towards their coat. Don't, I warned, my voice low and firm. There's nowhere to run here. The serpent, unmasked, stood before me, revealed in the fading light of a forgotten town. The wind, now a mournful whisper through the skeletal structures of the dried-up ghost town, carried the last echoes of a broken mind. The confession had been delivered not with remorse, but with a chilling, almost triumphant resignation. The serpent, indeed. But even a serpent, once cornered, eventually shed its skin. I watched as the local sheriff, a man whose patience I'd tested severely over the past few days, cuffed the killer. There was no struggle, no last-ditch plea. Just the metallic click of restraints and the shuffle of worn boots on the dusty ground. The killer, whose elaborate deception had cost a renowned historian his life and nearly fooled everyone, simply stared ahead, eyes vacant, as they were led towards the waiting vehicle. I felt no elation, only a profound weariness. The unraveling of such intricate lies always left a residue, a faint stain on the soul. It wasn't just about finding the who, but understanding the why, the twisted logic, the festering obsession that could drive someone to such extremes. Finch's murder wasn't about the ancient artifact, not truly. It was about a narrative, a fabricated history the killer desperately needed to believe, and Finch, in his academic purity, had threatened to dismantle it. The Chronos Scroll was merely a prop, a symbol of that contested truth. You had a hunch about the scroll, UserNL, the federal agent asked, his voice low, once the killer was secured. He gestured towards the now empty spot where the killer had stood. I nodded, rubbing a hand across my chin. The theft was too clean, too theatrical. And the killer's fixation on Finch's work wasn't purely academic. It was personal. The scroll wasn't meant for the black market. It was meant to be possessed, to be theirs. I pointed to a scuffed leather satchel that had fallen from the killer's grasp during the initial confrontation. Check that, or their vehicle. It won't be far. The sheriff, still shaking his head, moved to retrieve the satchel. A moment later, he let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be. He held up a cylindrical object, wrapped in oilcloth. It was unmistakable. The Chronos Scroll, its ancient parchment a deep, honeyed gold, now recovered. It wasn't pristine, a faint crease marred one edge, evidence of its hurried concealment. But it was intact. They never intended to sell it, I confirmed, observing the killer's fleeting glance back at the scroll. A flicker of proprietary triumph in their eyes before the agent ushered them into the car. The scroll held a truth the killer wanted to claim as their own. A secret connection to Finch's family history that they believed validated their own distorted narrative. Finch's research threatened to expose their claim as pure fantasy. So, the scroll became both the prize and the weapon of misdirection. The agent took the scroll carefully, his expression unreadable. A meticulous plan. For a rather abstract motive. The most dangerous ones often are, I replied, watching the federal vehicle disappear down the dusty track, leaving a plume of ochre in its wake. The sheriff lingered, exchanging a few final words of weary gratitude, before following suit. The puzzle pieces, once scattered and chaotic, now lay arranged, forming a complete, if tragic, picture. Finch's estate, I knew, would be handled by his distant cousin, the executor, a man who had seemed more concerned with the collection's monetary value than its historical significance. I'd already provided my recommendations to the authorities, that the Chronos Scroll, now authenticated and recovered, should be entrusted to a reputable institution, perhaps the National Archives, where its true historical context could be preserved, safe from avarice or obsession. Finch would have approved. The rest of his vast collection, I imagined, would be catalogued, appraised, and eventually dispersed, a legacy dissolving into individual transactions. A quiet end for a man of grand historical passions. I leaned against a crumbling wall, feeling the rough texture of sun-baked adobe beneath my palm. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The human mind, a labyrinth of desires and delusions. Every case was a journey into its intricate pathways, and every resolution, a bittersweet exit. I found myself drawn to these complexities, these intricate deceptions, not for the thrill of the chase, but for the stark, undeniable truth that lay hidden beneath layers of artifice. It was a compulsion, I suppose, to peel back the veils, to see what truly lay beneath. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me from my reverie. A new email. The subject line was terse, urgent inquiry, the serpent's eye. I stared at the words, a faint echo of the recently vanquished serpent in my mind. I felt a familiar stir, a quiet determination rekindling itself in the depths of my being. The weariness remained, but beneath it, the gears of my mind were already beginning to turn, anticipating the next riddle. I pocketed the phone, the ghost town fading into the encroaching twilight, and began my solitary walk back towards the road, towards whatever new labyrinth awaited.